Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Our text tonight is Daniel chapter 6. Daniel in the lion's den. Didn't we have a song about that? How'd that song go? Anybody remember? Daniel. Was it something like that? Daniel in the lion's den. Yeah, okay. VBS, I can remember. Yeah, did VBS for many years as a kid and as a young minister. And I was really bad at it. Especially those songs, and Father Abraham. Y'all remember Father Abraham, right? Where you get the dance. It's the only time you get to dance, is Father Abraham. But good memories. Some embarrassing, but good nonetheless. So this is probably a familiar story to a lot of us. Some of us grew up hearing this story as 4-year-olds or 5-year-olds or flannel boards and all sorts of presentations. And so we know this story, at least we have this memory of the story as a children's story. That's one of the ways in which we heard it. And as we look at it in Daniel, it's not particularly a children's story. I mean, throwing somebody in the lion's pit is probably you wouldn't let your 4-year-old see that on television, right? I mean, this is not designed for children, although it has a good ending. Well, maybe it's not an ending that you want to show your children either, because what happens to the people who accuse Daniel? They get thrown in the lion's den and they're devoured before they hit the ground. But not only the men, the women and children as well get thrown in there, which is a little disturbing when we think about that. And we can talk about that as we move along tonight. So this is not a children's story. It can be adapted. Think about Noah's Ark. That's not really a children's story, right? I mean, the whole world gets destroyed except for 8 people. I mean, that'll be traumatic nightmares for children, I think. But we don't tell it like that. We focus on 2 by 2 and we sing the songs, and so we kind of domesticate the stories for the sake of the children, and that's okay. Nothing wrong with that. But as we read it now as disciples of Jesus, we want to pay attention to it in a more, a fuller way, right? So one of the things that pops up at us is the king, Darius. Now, Darius the Mede is kind of a problem because he's not mentioned anywhere in the Babylonian records. Or Persian records. There's no record of a Darius the Mede. Now, there is a Darius the First, but he doesn't begin reigning until 522 BC. But Darius the Mede is in his first year, as we'll see later on, or as the ruler of Persia, or Babylon at least, as part of Persia. He's the king, but we have no record of him in any historical writing from the past. Now, this is not too surprising because remember, Belshazzar wasn't known except in one historian and Daniel. And then we discovered these Babylonian chronicles, and Belshazzar, he was in Babylon ruling with his father. So just because we don't have something doesn't mean it's fabricated, right? But that is what some would say. Some would say this is fabricated, or that it's confused, that the writer confused the Darius of 522 with this figure in 539, right? And so some would say, well, this is just wrong. Right? Well, historically, that's possible. But it's also possible that there are two other explanations. I mean, a third explanation would be we may discover some archive in the archaeological digs that his name pops up eventually. That could happen. We could also, though, postulate two other possibilities. One is, and I put it there on your handout, number 3, some suggest that Darius the Mede is Gubaru. We know him from the Babylonian records. And he was the guy who was made governor of Babylon, ruler of Babylon, when Cyrus, the Persian emperor, went back home. So Cyrus comes, conquers Babylon. Cyrus goes back to Nineveh, or back home, and leaves Gubaru as the representative of the king, the governor, whatever language you want to use. You could even call him king in some sense. And some think that that's who we're talking about here, that this is just another name for that guy. Maybe, maybe not. I'm thinking, my personal opinion is more like number 4 there, that actually Darius the Mede is another name for the same person, Cyrus the Great, or Cyrus the First, or Cyrus the Persian. If you go down to verse 28 of chapter 6, it says Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius. And most of your translations are going to say, and the reign of Cyrus the Persian, right? Most of your translations will say and. But the word and is in Hebrew just one little letter. I mean, it's just a straight down mark. And it has many functions in Hebrew. It can mean and, it can mean or, it can mean but, it can mean that is, or namely. And so you could translate that, and we have examples of this elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, although this is Aramaic right here, which same principles involved. That what he's doing is he's saying that the writer is saying, hey, I know who Darius the Mede, I know Darius the Mede and Cyrus the Persian are the same person. And so one translation that is quite possible and grammatically feasible is during the reign of Darius the Mede, namely the reign of Cyrus the Persian. In other words, the author is telling us this is the same person, has two different names, which is not uncommon in dynastic royalty, to have sometimes even the names like Cyrus or Darius are dynastic names, like King George IV, right? How many King Georges we had? Well, at least 4, right? But more than that, right? So something like that could be going on as well. So I don't think it's anything to get all get our feathers ruffled about. It's just an interesting problem that there's no clear solution to this problem. And any of these alternatives have their own problems. But what we do know is that the writer of Daniel is writing this story in the context of Darius the Mede, whom I think is most likely also the same person as Cyrus the Persian. Nothing sure about that, nothing certain about that, but it certainly is, I mean, it's clearly possible. And I would say maybe probable that that's what's going on here. Now, that's just the historical problem, the historical question that comes up when we read this chapter. But that doesn't have really anything to do with, it doesn't really matter in terms of what the theological significance of this chapter is. Whatever the historical situation might actually be, the theological statement is what we're interested in. So as you hopefully read this story before you came tonight, because we don't read the text, in this while we're coming through these long chapters. When you read this story, is there anything that jumped out at you that was like, oh, I didn't notice that before, or did you give that much attention to it? I want to give you an opportunity to just make some observations if you have some observations about what you noticed or what you noticed from your own memory of this story. How do you hear this story? Yeah.
Compares a lot to Zeus' death.
Okay.
Praying 3 times, and he had talked to God about, the word 3 is used a lot of times.
Okay. Yeah, the number 3. Yeah, it's a good point. The number 3, Jesus in the grave 3 days. Jesus prays 3 times in the Garden of Gethsemane. There's a deliverance of Jesus, right? He faces death. In fact, he does die, so that would be different. But yeah, some analogies in that way. Yeah.
The windows that were facing Bethlehem.
Uh-huh.
3 times.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, towards Jerusalem, praying towards Jerusalem, towards the holy place, right? So, yeah, I think that's a good point. There's an analogy there. Anything else anybody notice that you want to call attention to before we dig in? Yeah, Barbara.
It's interesting to me. This is a new ruler,
Mm.
but he uses the same. Is it satrap? What's it satrap? Is it
Yeah.
like a
Satraps, yeah. Yeah.
but he uses the local
Mm-hmm.
whatever, and that just seems to me.
Yeah, well, that's a good observation. I mean, Cyrus comes in or Darius comes in, and he's not going to stay there in Babylon, at least if he's Cyrus. He's not staying. But he also wants to administrate. He's got a big empire. The Persian Empire is going to get bigger than what it is at the moment. But he's got this one already is at the borders of India, which means it includes Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, and then we'll eventually spread across Turkey and Egypt. So this is a big place. He can't administer that by himself, right? So he calls all these 120 satraps and puts them as provincial. Yeah, well, you would use, like Daniel was brought to Babylon to be trained to be a part of the administration of the government. So you do choose locals as well, because locals can administer more easily than outsiders. Like if you brought in a Russian to govern Tennessee, I mean, what would you think about that? That's just not going to sit well, right? But you might find a Tennessean who would be qualified and loyal enough to administer for you. And then people you could trust, like Daniel, apparently trust Daniel. He knows Daniel somehow. Maybe he knows Daniel from the story previously about the handwriting on the wall. Maybe he knows Daniel from that. Maybe he knows Daniel from the high-level administrative position he had in the previous empire. So we're not really told why he has such a high view of Daniel, except Daniel has a character that he respects, right? Daniel is loyal. He's faithful. He's has good character. So this is somebody you can trust. Right? So he's highly regarded by Darius. Right? Anybody else? Go ahead, Nancy.
Thanks. Through Daniel, the king saw God. I thought.
Say that again.
Through Daniel,
Mm-hmm.
the king saw God.
Through Daniel, the king saw God. Okay.
Daniel was faithful to God, and his faithful impacted.
Okay.
And So then I asked my question, does my faithful to God impact those around me?
Okay, Daniel was faithful to God, and his faithfulness had an impact on other people, influence on other people. So Nancy raises the question, well, what about me? You know, is my faithfulness, or is my practice is a good witness to faithfulness to God? And how does that affect people around me? How do people perceive that in my life? Yeah. So yeah, good.
Yeah, Nancy covered what I was, you know, here, in comparison to Jesus' death, he was falsely accused,
Mm-hmm.
so was Jesus.
Okay, another analogy with Jesus, Pete, and Pete suggesting another analogy with Jesus, falsely accused.
Really liked, one of them liked Jesus. He
Mm.
was sorry, you know, that, Pilate said that he was sorry it had to happen.
Yeah, yeah,
And here, Jesus saying, you know,
okay.
he was probably in love with
Yeah, no, that's a good analogy in terms of some of the leadership was hesitant to execute Jesus, whereas some of the leadership was pushing for it. Yeah. Well, let's take a look then at what happens here. And on the handout, I'm just giving you the text, the scripture, basically. So there's nothing, you know, I'm quoting here. I'm not writing this. Yeah.
Daniel reminds me, him and Esther's story. They were
Okay.
bold and both very courageous.
Okay. Esther and Daniel, bold and courageous. All right. Yeah. You also kind of get the Joseph story a little bit too, right? Where Joseph gets thrown into prison because of false accusation. Joseph was thrown into a pit by his brothers. And so there's some analogies there. Right? So interesting. All right, so when we look at the first three verses, we get a sense of Daniel is prospering. Daniel is exhibiting a character that the king plans to appoint him king over the whole kingdom. You know, to give him maybe kind of like he's the guy in charge, kind of like Joseph got, right? Where Joseph was appointed the second ruler in Egypt. Maybe Daniel's rising to that level. And what's the response of the others who are in ruling with Daniel? What's their response? Jealous, all right? Any other words come to mind? Jealous is a good word. Resentful. You know, you can imagine how people might feel, right? Somebody's going to get exalted above you. Somebody's going to take a higher position than you. You might think of it as unfair, unjust. But some of those emotions are a part of the anger and what drives and motivates their particular agenda against Daniel. So they want to do something to Daniel. They want to get Daniel out of the way. How are they going to do that? What is their plan? Is it a statue? Yeah. It is. It does have the deal. It does deal with the role of the king. Yeah.
A royal statue, is that a different translation?
Yeah. What verse are you reading from?
Establish a royal statue. Maybe it's statute.
A statute, right? Ordinance,
Statute.
right? Not statue, but ordinance. When you said statue, I was thinking back to chapter 3. Yeah, but yeah. So establish an ordinance or an edict that says what?
Praise to any god or man during the next 3 years except the king.
So, yeah, if you pray to anyone except the king. Now let's think about that for a moment. What is that really talking about? I mean, is Cyrus or Darius, is he really thinking he's a god? That you can't pray to anybody else, huh? They have a lot of gods, right? There are a lot of gods, right? I'm sorry, Tom.
Appealing to the king's ego.
Yeah, it does appeal to the king's ego. Now, especially if you're going to say, okay, we're going to have an edict that says we can only pray to you because you're the only God for a month or whatever. You know, there's probably a limited amount of time here. And that's possible that they were thinking, okay, we're going to make Cyrus or Darius the god of the month or whatever. But in the ancient Near Eastern world, it was not as common to equate an emperor with a god. Now, Pharaoh did that in later times, and Roman emperors did that, but usually after they died, though some claimed it while they were alive, like Caligula or Nero or Domitian. But typically, how this worked was that the king would represent the god. That is, it's not that they were the god, but they were the representative of the gods. So I think maybe what's going on here, and it's hard to say for sure, that they were saying to Cyrus, look, we're going to get rid of we're going to pray through you. You are the one we're going to pray through. We're going to make you kind of the high priest of sorts. Doesn't use that language, of course, but we're going to make you the one who will mediate between the gods and us. So everybody has to go through you. So everybody has to pray to you so that you then represent us before the gods. Right? Does that make sense? You hear what I'm saying? Right? I think that's probably what's going on. Not that Darius thinks he's a god, but he can be persuaded that at least for a period of time, that you could only pray through Cyrus by praying to Cyrus, right? Darius. What I'm using them interchangeably. That makes more sense to me. It fits more the cultural context, and it also makes, by making kind of Cyrus or Darius the priest here for the whole of the nation, and he's the only one who can represent before the gods. That means everybody's got to go through him. So if you pray to anybody else, you're violating this edict. And of course, that's what happens with Daniel, right? Let's look at the language that describes Daniel. By the way, when they put out this edict, is it subject to change and alteration? No, it's not. It's called the law of the what? Medes and Persians. My dad would quote that to me every now and then. When you're driving the car, this is the law of the Medes and Persians. This is the way it's got to be. You can't change this. This is it. My dad was a preacher, and he loved that phrase, the law of the Medes and the Persians. So, I wasn't old enough to say, but you're not a king. Even if I thought of it, I wouldn't have said it. I know better than that. Let's go down to verse 10 of chapter 6. Oh, I got 5 here on some of these, don't I? 5, 10. It really should be 6. Daniel is accused and condemned. That should be 6, 10. Okay. So let's read a little bit of this. Although Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he continued to go to his house, which had windows in its upper room open toward Jerusalem, and to get down on his knees 3 times a day to pray to his God and praise him, just as he had done previously. Now, what does that tell us about Daniel? I'm sorry? Loyal to God. Okay, there's a loyalty here. Yeah, he's loyal. He's going to pray to God. He knows he's only supposed to pray to the king of Persia, but he's going to pray to God. All right, so loyalty. What else? Huh? He's not scared. He's courageous. Right? He's got courage. Is he flaunting it? No. Where's he doing it? In his private space, right? And in an upper room. Now, if this is a common construction in the ancient world and in the Middle East today, even. You build a structure, a home, and you put an upper room on it. And the upper room is where you could sleep a guest. It's a place of rest. It's a place of, because you get the coolness of the breeze on the roof. And the upper room would not be a place that you could look into very easily, would it? Yeah, Pete?
Maybe I looked at this too much about this being like Christ's death.
Mm-hmm.
They talk about he prayed 3 times a day. Well, Jesus went up 3 times with his disciples to pray, got by himself and prayed.
Yeah.
3 times.
Yeah, and Gethsemane, he went 3 times out. Yeah. So here we have, we got upper room as well there with Jesus, right? So let's think about if he's in this upper room and he's in a private space, he's not out on the street, kind of saying, "I'm going to show you. I'll pray to whoever I want." He's not out there beating the wind, drumming up business, drumming up. He's not calling attention to himself. He's just going to be obedient to his God privately, in his own way, without fanfare, without protest, he's just going to pray.
Respectfully to the outer people around him.
Yeah.
Not one.
Yeah, there's kind of a respect. It's not an agreement, right? But it is a respect that I'm not going to push this in a way that disturbs, right? I'm just going to retire to my private space in my upper room and pray. And he's not doing it as a novelty, right? This is not a new thing for him. This isn't like, oh, we got this edict. Oh, well, I'm going to start doing this then. It's not that sort of thing. It's rather, oh, we got this edict. I'm just going to keep doing what I do. And I'm going to go in my upper room and pray. I'm going to pray toward what? Yeah, Jerusalem, right? Which would be praying toward the west, where he was sitting. So he's going to pray toward Jerusalem through an open window, apparently. Maybe he's looking. I can imagine some of the flannel graph stuff here where the sun is shining, God is kind of shining through the window, and Daniel's praying, right? I can remember that. And those things really impact you as a kid, don't they? And they stick with us. And there's something good about that.
It was actually built around Daniel's habit of prayer, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's a good point. Was it built around the habit of prayer that Daniel had? That is, they know he does this praying. They know his habits. What's his posture when he's praying? He's on his knees. What does that tell you about when you kneel in prayer? What's that posture symbolizing? What is it saying? Humility? Submission? Any other ideas? Reverence? Okay. I mean, there's a lot bound up in that. Dependence, right? A sense of that kind of humility where we submit ourselves. We recognize a greater power. We recognize a greater one. We are not the number one in the world. We're not the all that is all, right? So the kneeling, the posture in prayer. I mean, there's a lot of different postures in the Bible. Can you name some of the postures? I mean, there's kneeling. There's hands, right? Praying with holy hands, right? Lifting up holy hands. That's a posture. There's standing for prayer. There's prostrate, where you fall on your face like Jesus did in the garden, falling on his face to pray. There's praying in bed, lying down. So there's all kinds of postures. One is not necessarily better than the other. One is not right, the other one wrong. They're all good postures. But they do represent maybe how we are feeling at that moment. The kind of posture, like when you first get some really tragic news and your knees go weak, right? And you fall on your knees. I remember the night I was told at 2 a.m. that my wife was dead. And I was standing when they told me that, and my knees just crumbled, and I went down. So there was kind of a yearning, a hurting that crumbled my knees. So postures kind of reflect maybe what's happening in our lives at the moment, what we're feeling. And maybe it's good to have different postures at different times. Yeah, Pete?
To Moscow and Beirut, Lebanon, when I went in there, it was strange to see all those people on the days with a head on them.
Mm-hmm.
Totally.
Yeah. Kneeling has a long history in the church. Anglicans kneel, Catholics kneel at different times in the service, and there's something to be said for that. They of course they arrange their furniture in such a way that makes it easy to kneel with kneeling pads and that sort of thing. Kneeling in our great space would be kind of painful, to kneel on that floor, without some cushion of some sort. And it used to be, I can remember my dad kneeling in prayer when he led prayer at church. Anybody have that kind of experience? Yeah. When he would be at the pulpit and he'd come over to the side and he would kneel to pray. And he would do that at home too. There's something beautiful about that, seems to me. So maybe kneeling in this may be his normal posture. It may be this is what he did every time he prayed these 3 times a day. Or it may reflect kind of, God, I'm praying to you now, and there are going to be people who don't like this. Who knows? Praying 3 times a day is apparently a habit in ancient Israel. We see it in the Psalms, for example. I think it's Psalm 55, verses maybe something like 16, 17, that talks about praying evening, morning, noon, because the Jewish day begins in the evening. Right? Is it 55, verse 17? Oh, it's good to be confirmed. So Psalm 55, verse 17, evening, morning, noon, 3 times a day. Yeah. So Daniel's not doing anything unique, and he's not doing anything public. He's just praying. And the accusers see him. Now, they must have been looking for it. All right. If he's up in his upper room, I don't know, were they in a higher spot or, I don't know. We're not told exactly how they saw this, but they report him to the king. Now, let's talk about the lion's den for a moment. When Daniel gets thrown into the lion's den, and by the way, having a pit of lions was not an unusual thing in kind of empires and ruling classes. There were plenty of lions around. I just read, I was at an archaeological lecture yesterday, and he read a letter from between two Egyptians, and one Egyptian talking about how dangerous it was to travel in the Sinai. It's very dangerous. There's a lot of lions everywhere, in the Sinai. So lions are very common, in that part of the world and in what we know as Babylon as well. And to have a lion pit could be zoological, right? We just enjoy seeing lions, but also they had a function of punishment. And maybe even a function of a trial by ordeal. Because when Darius throws him in, not personally, but when he gets him into the lion's den, what does Darius do? What does he do?
May your God whom you serve continually rescue you.
Yeah. Yeah, like in verses 17, 18, or somewhere in there. May your God whom you faithfully serve deliver you. All right. So he's thrown him into the lion's den, but at the same time, he's praying that God would deliver him. What does that tell you about what he thinks this is about? It's what, Pat? Thought I heard somebody say something. So what does he think that's about? He thinks it's, well, we're going to do this trial. I'm going to throw you in the lion's den because that's what the law of the Medes and Persians says to do. Right? I'm going to punish you, and I'm going to throw you in the lion's den. But he is thinking that the lion's den is going to be a trial by ordeal. Now think about what a trial by ordeal is. It's like well, here's a famous kind of trial by ordeal. Is this person guilty or innocent? Well, let's find out. How are we going to find out? Well, we're going to throw them in the river. If they drown, they're guilty. If they live, they're innocent. That's a trial by ordeal. Right? So I think the king is thinking like that. He's going to throw him in the lion's den, and he's going to ask the blessing upon Daniel that, okay, if your God is a real God, and if you are being faithful to your God, may your God deliver you. May your God claim you innocent and deliver you from the lions.
So are you saying he wanted to believe in Daniel's story?
I think he wanted Daniel to live, right? And you couldn't trust the gods he prayed to, right? So I think your God, may your God, right? Isn't that what he says? May your God, whom you faithfully serve, deliver you. All right, we're going to trust your God on this, Daniel. We're not trusting me. We're not trusting the Babylonian gods. We're going to trust Daniel's God. See what happens. And so the next morning, you get a sense of how the king kind of likes Daniel. So what happens in the morning? Oh, well, what happens through the night, by the way? The king is not only praying, the king is doing what? Yeah, he's kind of fasting. He's worried. He's engaged. This is consuming him. And so when the daylight comes, he runs to the den to see what has happened. And he cried out anxiously to Daniel, chapter 5, 19, 20. O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you faithfully serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? Now, notice kind of the lines there. Your God.
The living God.
The living God, right, whom you serve, faithfully serve, deliver you. That's the theology in a succinct sentence, isn't it? The living God, whom you serve, faithfully serve, will deliver you. That's the question in the king's mind. And Daniel answers. O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me, because I was found blameless before him. And also before you, O king, I have done no wrong. Trial of my ordeal is over. Daniel's been proved innocent by his deliverance. Notice how respectful he is to the king. Isn't that kind of, I think I'd be looking at the king saying, well, you threw me down here. You know, I don't like you at all. You know, you should have trusted me. You know, why didn't you stand up for me? You know, I mean, you could hear that kind of response from Daniel, I would think. But no, he is content that God sent an angel to shut the lion's mouth. Now think about that imagery of being in the midst of lions, but being at peace. Being at peace in the midst of lions because you trust in your God. That's pretty powerful. And it's, yeah, go ahead, Tom. Yeah. This in chapter 3 and chapter 6 are kind of parallel, right? God's delivering them from certain death, whether by fire or by lions. So I think when we read this story and we hear that line from Daniel and the question from the king and Daniel's response to it, there's a couple of things that come into my mind. One is that this is the picture of the new heaven and new earth, where the lion and the lamb will lie down together, right? There won't be that hostility. There won't be that fear. There's a peace between the lion and the lamb. There's a peace between the child playing by what? By the snake. What do you call it? Snake den? Snake? What's the right word? I don't remember. Snake pit? What? The nest or whatever. Yeah. I don't know. You know what I'm talking about. So, we have those images in Isaiah of what the renewed world is going to look like, what Eden presumably looked like. And here Daniel is kind of experiencing that. He's experiencing the future that is in store for all of us by being present in the midst of lions and being at peace with it. Now, we can also do it metaphorically. Something else that comes to mind is the metaphor of living among lions. And the Psalms use that metaphor quite often in thinking about how our enemies, in whatever way they come, our enemies are like lions trying to devour us. Think about the, 1 Peter 5, that Satan is a roaring lion seeking to devour us, right? But God can stop the mouth of lions. Right? So having peace, we can maybe even think about it in terms of all the junk that's going on around us. All the fighting, all the backbiting, all the sniping, all the lying, all the bitterness. All these lions are tearing at us. But God can stop the mouth of the lion. And we can be at peace with ourselves, with each other, with God, in the midst of the lion's den. Yeah, Pete.
I go back to the New Testament again. Paul mentioned something like this, and I think it includes them too. Paul said we're going to be persecuted.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have a choice in it.
Yeah.
But one thing about it, we know that it cannot separate us from the love of God.
Yeah. Romans 8 cannot separate us from the love of God. Persecution, death, nor life, nor demons, or nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. Exactly. Even Jesus was in the wilderness. Remember when he was in the wilderness? Mark says and he was with the wild animals. That would include lions out there in the wilderness of Judea. So Jesus lived in peace with the animals while he was in the wilderness. I think that's the point of that. So I think it's a really important theological point to hear in a peaceful presence in the midst of life. That we can have a non-anxious presence. We're not worried. We're not afraid. Even when we're surrounded by lions, we're okay. We can feel the peace. We don't have to get all excited, all out of whack, all worried, threatened to leave the country if somebody's elected. You know, we don't have to get that way. We can be peaceful, have peace in ourselves, because we trust in the God who delivers. We trust in the God who lives. Right? Now, what happens to those who accuse Daniel? Well, that's just a reflection of the culture and the time, it seems to me. This is what you did in the ancient world. When the family offended, represented by the one, the whole family suffered. And so I think what we have is a description not necessarily of something, oh, God liked that. No, that's not saying that at all. It's not saying, oh, yeah, God's in favor of that. No, it's just a description of how Darius, or the king, responded. But the last thing we want to focus on, I know we're a little bit over time, but we do have to pay attention, it seems to me, to the doxology that the king offers at the end here. When he says, "For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, for he has saved Daniel from the power of the lions." Wow, that's a confession. It's a doxology for all of us. But it comes at an important point in Daniel, because here at the end of chapter 6 is the last story of the narratives. Chapters 1 to 6 is all narrative prose, right? Court stories, stories about the court, the king's court. Chapter 7 begins the apocalyptic visions. Things get a little harder to understand, in the next section. But here at the kind of in the middle of Daniel, at the place where you change genres, you move from historical narrative prose to apocalyptic genre, right? At the hinge of that is this doxology that really summarizes the whole book. It summarizes the narratives that we've been reading so far, and it tells us what the apocalyptic visions are about too. That is, the living God who reigns forever and delivers and rescues his people. That's going to be the story of the apocalyptic visions as well. God rules and delivers, even over the intents and schemes of the kingdoms of this world, whether it's the Persian king or the Babylonian king or the Greek king or the Roman king. It's God's kingdom that has no end. And God delivers his people, even under the worst of circumstances. And his people remain faithful in the midst of all that pressure. And when we're under pressure, and whenever we're on all kinds of pressure. We got people telling us, on the one hand, you don't vote for so-and-so, you're evil. If you don't vote for this person, you're evil. And they're trying to make an election, about a national election, some sort of test of your Christianity or your test of your faith, that bothers me. Bothers me greatly. We don't put our faith in these kingdoms. The living God endures forever, and his kingdom endures forever. And we are faithful to that kingdom. That's where my allegiance is. That's why we pray the Lord's Prayer. I call the Lord's Prayer the Kingdom Pledge of Allegiance. The Kingdom Pledge of Allegiance. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, right? And I will commit to it just as you are committed to me. You're committed to me to forgive my sin. You're committed to me to give me daily bread. You're committed to me to lead me and deliver me from the evil one. But it is your glory and your kingdom and your will. And hallowed be your name, not mine. Right? Our pledge of allegiance. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with us all. Amen.
And also with you. Thank you, John.
Thank you.